The hammer strikes echoed flat and hard across the dry valley air. John Hutchinson pulled his roan gelding, Rusty, to a halt. He sat loose in the saddle, narrowing his eyes against the late afternoon sun. 60 yards down the dirt road, a man in a bowler hat was driving a heavy iron nail into Hutch's front gate. It wasn't just any gate. That thick cedar post had been planted by his grandfather 50 years ago, back when this territory was nothing but wild prairie and bad intentions. Hutch touched his spurs to Rusty's flanks. The horse moved into a steady, ground-eating trot. By the time Hutch pulled up, the man in the bowler was stepping back to admire his work. 2 other men sat nearby in a black buggy. They didn't look like cowboys or ranch hands. They looked like hired muscle from the city, their suit jackets tight across their shoulders. "You lost?" Hutch asked. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that usually happens right before a thunderstorm. The man in the bowler turned. He had soft hands and a nervous twitch in his left eyelid. "You John Hutchinson?" "Depends on who's asking." "I'm serving official notice on behalf of the Northern Pacific Syndicate, Mr. Hutchinson." The man pointed to the crisp white paper nailed to the weathered wood. "You have 30 days to vacate the premises." Hutch didn't look at the paper. He kept his eyes on the man. "Vacate," Hutch repeated. The word tasted like copper in his mouth. "That's right. This land is the legal property of Mr. Arthur Pendleton." Hutch shifted his weight in the saddle. The leather creaked in the silence. He reached down, pulled the claw end of his fencing hammer from his saddlebag, and leaned over. In one smooth motion, he ripped the paper from the wood, taking the nail with it. He crumpled the notice into a ball and tossed it into the dust at the man's boots. "You tell your Mr. Pendleton," Hutch said, his tone still perfectly level, "that this dirt bled from my family. He wants it. He better bring more than a piece of paper." The man swallowed hard, taking a slow step back toward the buggy. "It's a court order, Hutchinson, a territorial deed. Your grandfather's original claim was forged." Hutch froze. The buggy driver cracked his whip. The horses bolted, kicking up a sudden cloud of pale dust that coated the cedar post. Hutch sat alone, listening to the receding rattle of the wooden wheels. He looked down at the crumpled white paper lying in the dirt. His grandfather's claim? Forged? That was impossible. He knew the history of every inch of this homestead. He knew the blood it took to hold it. But as the dust settled, a cold, heavy knot formed in his stomach. The man hadn't sounded like he was bluffing. He sounded like a man who knew a secret. Who the hell told him that? The ride into Oakhaven took an hour, but to Hutch, it felt like 5 minutes. His mind was turning the same impossible thought over and over. Forged. He let Rusty pick his own pace down the wagon-rutted road. Every few miles, Hutch passed a fresh pine stake driven into the prairie grass with a red ribbon tied to the top. Railroad markers. The Northern Pacific Syndicate was carving its way west, and they did not care what they stepped on. Oakhaven wasn't the town he grew up in anymore. The old weathered wooden facades were slowly giving way to heavy imported brick. The quiet hum of the livery stable had been replaced by the steady, metallic tapping of the telegraph office. Progress, the politicians called it. Hutch just called it loud. He hitched Rusty to the rail in front of the Oakhaven Miners and Farmers Bank. He needed to pull the payroll for his ranch hands. Tomorrow was Friday. You didn't keep men waiting on their pay. Not if you wanted them to respect you in the dirt and the heat. He stepped inside. The air in the bank was stifling, smelling of cheap cigar smoke and fresh ink. Young Jimmy, the teller, looked up from his heavy leather ledger. The boy's polite smile vanished the second he saw Hutch. Jimmy dropped his dip pen, leaving a dark black blot on the page, and immediately looked toward the frosted glass door of the manager's office. Hutch walked up to the brass grill. He didn't say a word. He just reached into his coat and laid his worn leather bank book on the marble counter. Jimmy swallowed hard. He didn't touch the book. "Mr. Hutchinson," the boy started, his voice cracking. "I have to go get Mr. Higgins." Before Hutch could answer, the frosted glass door opened. Silas Higgins stepped out. Higgins was a man who always looked like his collar was a half-inch too tight. Right now, he was sweating straight through his heavy wool suit. "John," Higgins said, wiping his pale forehead with a handkerchief, "come on back to my office." "I don't need a meeting. Silas, I need to pull $40 for payroll." Higgins shook his head slowly. "I can't do that, John." Hutch went perfectly still. The ambient noise of the bank, the ticking clock, the shuffling boots of a farmer in the corner, seemed to drop away. "You can't or you won't." Higgins glanced nervously around the lobby, painfully aware of the few customers watching them. "Please, it's under legal dispute. A man named Arthur Pendleton walked in here yesterday with a writ from the Capitol. He claims the Northern Pacific Syndicate holds the rightful title to your land." Hutch pulled a crumpled, nail-torn notice from his vest pocket and dropped it on Higgins' desk. "You mean this?" Higgins stared at the paper like it was a coiled rattlesnake. "Yes. I'm sorry, John. My hands are tied by the territory. Pendleton has the law in his pocket. If I dispense any funds to you, I lose my charter. You can't buy seed, you can't pay your men, you can't even buy a bag of coffee on credit until this is cleared up." Hutch didn't yell. He didn't threaten the man. He just stared at him until Higgins had to look down at his own shoes. "My grandfather bled out on that soil fighting off cattle rustlers," Hutch said softly. "My mother is buried beneath the old oak on the North Ridge. You tell this Pendleton that paper doesn't make him an owner." Hutch turned and walked out of the bank. He left his leather book sitting on the marble counter. It was useless now anyway. The sunlight outside felt harsh and blinding. Hutch stood on the wooden boardwalk, watching a heavy freight wagon rumble past, kicking up dust that coated his boots. He was a man suddenly drowning in dry air. No money, no credit, 30 days to leave his own life behind. He crossed a dusty street, dodging a pair of stray dogs, and stepped up onto the porch of Martha's Mercantile. The bell above the door jingled. The rich smell of roasted coffee, saddle soap, and dried apples hit him instantly. It was the only place in town that still smelled like the world he knew. Martha was behind the long wooden counter, hauling a 50-pound sack of flour like it weighed nothing. She was a tall woman, lean and sharp-eyed, with graying hair tied back in a no-nonsense bun. She had buried 2 husbands, raised no children, and built the biggest supply store in the county through pure, stubborn grit. "Put that down before you break your back," Hutch said, stepping over to grab the thick canvas sack. "I was doing just fine before you walked in." She shot back, though she stepped aside and let him take the weight. "You look awful. Hutch, you sleep in that shirt, or did you just lose a fight with a wildcat?" "Neither." Hutch set the flour heavily onto the iron scales. Martha wiped her dusty hands on her apron and studied his face. The dry humor faded from her eyes immediately. She knew him too well. She reached under the counter and pulled out 2 thick ceramic mugs. Pouring black coffee from a metal pot she kept warm on the iron stove. She slid a mug across the wood to him. "All right, what happened?" Hutch took a sip. It was bitter, hot, and strong. Exactly what he needed. "The bank froze my accounts. Silas Higgins says a man named Arthur Pendleton put an injunction on my land. Claims my family's deed is a forgery." Martha stopped wiping the counter. The damp rag sat motionless under her hand. Pendleton, she repeated. The name sounded like a curse in her mouth. You know him? I know his type, she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He's been in town for a week, staying in the corner suite at the Grand Hotel. He wears silk vests and drinks imported brandy. He's the one who bought out the Miller farm last month. Miller wouldn't sell. Hutch said, frowning. He swore he'd die on that property. He told me himself. He didn't have a choice. Pendleton dug up some unpaid tax lien from 10 years ago, squeezed Miller until he broke, and walked away with nothing. But Hutch, Miller's land was one thing. Your place is a federal homestead grant. It was signed off by the territorial governor himself. They can't just claim it's forged. They just did. Hutch pulled the crumpled notice from his pocket again and laid it flat on the scarred wooden counter. He smoothed out the sharp creases with his heavy thumbs. Martha pulled a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses from her apron pocket and slipped them onto her nose. She leaned over the paper, her eyes scanning the dense legal print. Her fingers stopped near the bottom of the page. Hutch, she said, her voice tight, have you actually read this whole thing? No. I pulled it off a cedar post and threw it in the dirt. Martha tapped the paper. The syndicate isn't challenging your grandfather's original claim. They aren't saying the governor didn't sign it. They're challenging the transfer of title. What does that mean? It means they claim your grandfather sold the land before he died. They claim they have a bill of sale, making them the rightful legal heirs. Hutch let out a short, harsh laugh. My grandfather hated the railroad. He hated Easter money. He would never sell to a syndicate. I know that, Martha said, but look at the date on this alleged sale. She slid the paper toward him. Hutch looked down at the smudged black ink. The date was circled in red by some unseen lawyer in a distant city. October 14th, 1874. The breath left Hutch's lungs. The noise of the street outside faded into a dull, hollow ring in his ears. He stared at the numbers until they blurred together. The year the winter storms came early and killed half the herd. The year his father died of consumption in the front bedroom. And the exact week his older brother, William, had packed a single saddlebag, stolen the family's best horse, and disappeared into the night, never to be seen again. Why? Hutch thought, his pulse hammering a frantic rhythm in his throat. Would the syndicate have a deed dated the exact week William ran away? Martha looked up at him over her wire glasses. Hutch, who else had access to your grandfather's strongbox back then? Hutch didn't answer. He turned and looked out the front window of the mercantile, toward the distant, rolling mountains. The past wasn't dead. It had just put on a suit, hired a lawyer, and come back to steal his home. Hutch left Martha's mercantile with the taste of bitter coffee and old betrayal in his mouth. The wooden boardwalk groaned under his heavy boots. He didn't bother untying Rusty from the hitching post. He walked straight down the center of Main Street toward the Grand Hotel. The Grand was a 3-story brick monstrosity that had gone up 6 months ago. It was funded entirely by Eastern rail money and stood out like a sore thumb against the weathered timber of the older buildings. It had polished brass gas lamps flanking the double doors and a woven Turkish rug in the lobby that cost more than a herd of prime steers. Hutch pushed through the glass-paneled doors. The lobby smelled like lemon oil, fresh paint, and money. A young clerk in a stiff high collar stepped out from behind the mahogany front desk. Sir, I must ask you to clean your boots before you walk on the rug. Where's Arthur Pendleton? Hutch asked. The clerk stopped talking. He took one look at the set of Hutch's jaw and the dry dirt ground into his denim trousers, and decided his weekly salary wasn't nearly high enough to argue. Parlor room B, sir. Down the hall. Hutch didn't thank him. He walked down the carpeted corridor, his silver spurs ringing sharply against the floorboards where the rugs didn't reach. He opened the heavy oak door without knocking. The parlor was stiflingly warm. A fire crackled in the green marble hearth, entirely unnecessary for the warm season. Sitting in a leather wingback chair was a man in his late 40s. He wore a charcoal suit and a silk cravat. He was methodically peeling a red apple with a small silver pocket knife. He didn't jump when the door slammed open. He just kept peeling. The red skin curled off the fruit in one long, continuous ribbon. "Mr. Hutchinson, I presume," Pendleton said. His voice was incredibly smooth. It carried the polished, effortless accent of a Boston boarding school. "I was wondering when you would make an appearance." Hutch closed the door behind him. The heavy iron latch clicked into place, sealing them in. "You sent your dogs to my gate today," Hutch said. "Process servers," Pendleton corrected gently, not looking up from his apple. "A necessary legal formality. Please take a seat." Hutch didn't move. "You froze my accounts at the bank." "I protected my syndicate's financial interests." Pendleton finally set the silver knife down. "If you drain the accounts tied to that property, I have to spend months in territorial litigation to recover the funds. This is simply cleaner." Pendleton looked up. His eyes were pale blue and completely dead. There was no malice in them, just arithmetic. He looked at Hutch the way a butcher looks at a side of beef. Hutch took 2 slow steps toward the chair. "I don't know what kind of forged paper you bought, Pendleton. I don't know what desperate thief sold it to you. But Silas Hutchinson never signed away his homestead. He built it from the dirt up." Pendleton's sight. He reached into his tailored breast pocket and produced a folded sheet of heavy vellum. He held it out between 2 clean fingers. "I expected this kind of emotional denial," Pendleton said. "It is human nature to hold on to things that do not belong to you. But the territorial court has already reviewed the provenance of the document. The signature was authenticated by 3 separate clerks in the capital." Hutch didn't take the paper. He didn't need to. He could see the black ink from where he stood. He could see the looping letter S of his grandfather's name at the bottom of the page. It looked perfect, too perfect. "My grandfather broke his wrist in the winter of '72, Hutch said quietly. "A roping accident in a blizzard. After that, his handwriting dragged on the paper. He couldn't close his loops. That signature, right? That was written by someone with a perfectly steady hand." Pendleton's polite smile didn't waver a fraction of an inch. A fascinating piece of family trivia. Unfortunately, the law relies on official ledgers, not family lore. The deed was witnessed and stamped by the county surveyor at the time, a Mr. Elias Thorne. "It is an airtight document, Mr. Hutchinson. You have no legal recourse." Hutch felt the muscles in his jaw tighten until his teeth ached. He wanted to cross the Persian rug, grab Pendleton by the silk cravat, and drag him out into the dusty street. It would take exactly 3 seconds to break the man's jaw. Pendleton saw the slight shift in Hutch's posture. He leaned back comfortably in his chair. "You are a large man, Mr. Hutchinson. You are clearly accustomed to imposing your will through physical intimidation. But if you touch me, the federal marshal station downstairs in the dining room will arrest you for assault. You will sit in a territorial cell while I take possession of your ranch tomorrow morning. Your cattle will be auctioned. Your mother's grave will be paved over for a switching station." Pendleton picked up his silver knife again and sliced a piece of the apple. "You cannot punch your way out of a legal contract. The era of the gunfighter is over. We fight with ink now, and I have an ocean of it." Hutch stared at him for a long, heavy moment. The urge to strike the man was a physical burning in his blood. But he realized with a sickening clarity that Pendleton was absolutely right. A dead man couldn't fight a lawsuit. A man in an iron cage couldn't protect his land. He needed Elias Thorne. He needed the man who supposedly witnessed the lie. "You better hope that ink doesn't wash off," Hutch said. He turned and walked out of the parlor, leaving Pendleton alone with the fire. The ride back to the ranch was the longest of his life. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the western ridge, bleeding purple and bruised orange across the endless prairie sky. The air cooled, but the heat in Hutch's chest remained. When he finally rode through his own gate, the front yard was quiet. Too quiet. Usually, by this time of the evening, the bunkhouse was loud. You could hear the sound of harmonica, the clatter of tin plates, and the rough laughter of tired men. Tonight, there was only the sound of wind whistling through the dry corral boards. Hutch swung down from Rusty, his boots hitting the dirt heavy and tired. He walked toward the long wooden bunkhouse. The door was propped open to let in the evening breeze. Inside, sitting around a cold potbelly stove, were his 3 remaining hands. Old Man Cobb, a kid named Billy who couldn't have been more than 18, and a quiet, lethal vaquero named Mateo. They all looked up when Hutch walked in. Nobody said a word. The lantern light flickered, casting long shadows against the log walls. "I couldn't pull the payroll," Hutch said, keeping his voice steady and looking each man in the eye. "The bank froze my accounts. The railroad syndicate is trying to claim the deed to the land." Billy looked down at his scuffed boots. Cobb spit a stream of dark tobacco juice into an empty tin, sitting on the floorboards. "I don't know how long this litigation is going to take," Hutch continued, taking off his hat. "I don't know when I can pay you. If you need to pack your bedrolls and ride out tonight, I won't think any less of you. You earned your wages, and I'll find a way to get you your money down the line. I swear it." Silence stretched in the dusty room. A coyote howled somewhere out near the ridge. Mateo slowly pulled his whetstone from his pocket and began running it along the edge of his skinning knife. The rhythmic, metallic scrape filled the quiet room. "I worked for the railroad once, in Texas," Mateo said, never looking up from the steel blade. "They feed you rotten meat, and they treat you like a blind mule. I like the meat here better." Cobb chuckled. It was a dry, rattling sound deep in his chest. "Hell, Hutch, where am I going to go? My back hurts too much to learn a new trail, and nobody else is going to put up with my snoring. We ain't leaving." Hutch felt a sudden, sharp tightness in his throat. He wasn't a man who cried, but the loyalty of these tired, broke men hit him harder than Pendleton's threats. He nodded once, swallowing hard. "Thank you." But as he turned to leave the bunkhouse to unsaddle his horse, Billy finally spoke up. His voice was trembling, entirely lacking Cobb bravado. "Hutch?" "Yeah, Billy. If they just want the land, why are they cutting off the water?" Hutch froze in the doorway. He turned around slowly, his hand dropping from the doorframe. "What are you talking about?" Billy pointed out the small, dirty window toward the northern ridge, where the shadows were deepest. "Me and Mateo were riding fence line near the canyon a few hours ago. There's 50 men up there. They got wagons full of timber and crates of blasting powder. They're building a dam across Sweetwater Creek." Hutch stepped to the window and looked out into the gathering dark. The creek was the only source of water for his entire herd. Without it, in this dry heat, the cattle would start dying of thirst in 3 days. Pendleton wasn't just fighting with ink in a courtroom. He was starting a siege. They rode out under a heavy, bruised sky. The moon was a pale sliver cutting through the clouds, casting long and jagged shadows across the canyon floor. Hutch pulled his grandfather's heavy silver pocket watch from his vest. He struck a lucifer match against his saddle horn and cupped a small flame. The yellow light danced over the cracked glass face. It was exactly 23 minutes past 9. He blew the match out. The darkness rushed back in, thicker than before. They pushed the horses harder. Sweetwater Creek wasn't just a stream. It was the main artery of the entire valley. It flowed down from the high limestone ridges, cutting straight through Hutch's north pasture before feeding into the basin. Without it, the grass would turn to dust, and the cattle would follow shortly after. As they crested the final ridge, the sound hit them. It wasn't the natural, quiet rush of moving water. It was a violent, rhythmic crack of iron axes biting into wood. Over that, the shouts of men and the heavy thud of sledgehammers driving posts into the muddy banks. Hutch pulled Rusty to a halt. Mateo, Cobb, and young Billy pulled up beside him. Down in the shallow ravine, 20 men were working by the light of a half-dozen kerosene lanterns. They had already dropped 3 massive pine trunks across the choke point of the creek. Men waist-deep in the cold water were packing the gaps with heavy canvas sacks of river rock and clay. The water on Hutch's side of the dam had already slowed to a pathetic, muddy trickle. Cobb spat into the dirt. That's a permanent build. They ain't just diverting it. Hutch, they're stopping it dead. Hutch didn't say a word. He guided Rusty down the steep embankment, the horse's hooves sliding in the loose shale. He didn't try to hide his approach. The clatter of falling rocks announced them loud and clear. The axes stopped. The shouting died down. 20 men turned to look up the slope. Several of them dropped their shovels and reached for the rifles leaning against the nearby supply wagons. Hutch rode straight down to the edge of the muddy bank. His 3 hands fanned out behind him. Mateo was casually resting his hand on the pommel of his saddle, inches from his revolver. Cobb already had his shotgun resting across his lap. Billy looked terrified, his knuckles white on his reins, but he didn't back up an inch. A man separated himself from the workers and walked up the muddy bank. He was built like a freight train, with shoulders that strained the fabric of his canvas coat and a thick, dark beard coated in sawdust. He carried a Winchester repeater casually in his right hand. "You're trespassing," the big man said. His voice was a deep, grating rumble that carried easily over the noise of the trapped water. "You're standing on my property," Hutch replied, his voice calm, "and you're choking my water. I'm giving you 5 minutes to pull those logs out of the creek." The big man laughed. It was a cold, humorless sound. "I'm Briggs. I work for Mr. Pendleton. And according to the papers sitting in my wagon, this creek, these trees, and the mud you're standing on belong to the Northern Pacific Syndicate. Now turn those horses around before I have my boys empty your saddles." To prove his point, a dozen lever-action rifles clicked in the darkness. The metallic clacking echoed off the canyon walls. Mateo didn't flinch. He just shifted his weight slightly, locking his eyes on the man standing closest to Briggs. "Territorial law guarantees downstream water rights," Hutch said, ignoring the rifles entirely. "Even if that deed was worth the paper it's printed on, you can't dam a natural waterway. That's a federal offense." Briggs grinned, showing a row of crooked teeth in the lantern light. "Out here, the man paying the wages is the federal government, and Mr. Pendleton pays very well. You got no authority. Hutchinson, you got no sheriff coming to save you, and you definitely don't have enough men to take this ridge." Hutch tightened his grip on the reins. He knew Briggs was right. If a fight started here, Mateo might take down 3 or 4 of them, and Cobb's scattergun would clear the bank, but there were simply too many rifles in the dark. Billy would be dead before he even cleared leather. Hutch had never backed down from a fight in his life, but he wasn't going to get his men killed over a pile of wet wood. He was just about to pull his horse around when a noise broke the tense silence. It was the sound of a glass bottle shattering against a rock. Everyone turned toward the supply wagons. A man was pulling himself up from the ground, leaning heavily against the wooden spokes of a wagon wheel. He was thin, entirely too thin, his clothes hanging off his frame like rags on a scarecrow. He had wild, thinning gray hair and a face baked dark and wrinkled by decades in sun. He was drunk, very, very drunk. "Shut up, Elias," Briggs snapped, not looking away from Hutch. "Get back in the wagon." The ragged man didn't listen. He stumbled forward, stepping into the circle of lantern light. He squinted up at Hutch, swaying slightly on his feet. "Hutchinson," the old man muttered, the word slurred heavily on his tongue. He took another unsteady step forward, peering closely at Hutch's face. "You ain't Silas," the old man whispered. "I'm his grandson, John." The old man's eyes widened. They were pale, bloodshot, and completely filled with terror. He lifted a trembling, dirt-stained hand and pointed a crooked finger at Hutch. "John, right, you got his eyes. You got the old man's eyes. But your brother, William." Hutch felt his blood run entirely cold. He urged his horse a step forward. "What did you just say?" Elias let out a sudden, jagged sob. He grabbed the side of his own head, his fingers digging into his wild hair. "I told him not to do it. I told him the ink wasn't dry. But he said it didn't matter. He said nobody would ever check the cornerstones." "Elias," Briggs roared, stepping toward the old man. "I told you to shut your mouth." Briggs reached out and shoved the old man hard in the chest. Elias fell backward into the mud, scrambling away like a frightened dog. "Who is that?" Hutch demanded, his voice slicing through the heavy air. "Nobody you need to worry about," Briggs growled, raising his Winchester. "Last warning, Hutchinson. Ride out. Now." But Hutch wasn't looking at the rifle. He was staring at the old man crawling away in the mud. A memory clicked into place. The name on the eviction notice. The county surveyor who supposedly witnessed the forged deed 50 years ago. Elias Thorne. Pendleton hadn't just bought a forged deed. He had bought the man who stamped it. And he had brought him here, probably to redraw the new property lines once the syndicate took over. Elias staggered to his feet, looked back at Hutch with absolute panic in his eyes, and then turned and bolted into the thick brush along the creek bank. The darkness swallowed him instantly. "Hutch!" Cobb yelled, raising his shotgun as two of the syndicate men leveled their rifles at Elias's retreating back. "Don't shoot," Hutch ordered. He looked at Briggs. The big foreman was glaring into brush, his jaw set in anger. "Briggs," Hutch said quietly, "you can keep the water for tonight. But if you touch one hair on that old man's head, I will come back here and drown you in this creek myself." Hutch pulled Rusty around sharply. "Let's go." They spurred their horses back up the loose shale embankment, leaving the lantern light behind. The syndicate men didn't fire. They just watched them disappear into the night. Once they were over the ridge and out of sight, Hutch pulled up again. The horses were breathing heavy in the dark. Billy was shaking, adrenaline finally catching up to him. "We're just leaving? They're keeping the water." "They can have the water," Hutch said, his eyes scanning the dense tree line to the east. "We aren't going home." Mateo pulled his revolver and quietly checked the cylinder in the moonlight. "We are hunting the old drunk." "That old drunk is Elias Thorne," Hutch said. "He's the original surveyor. He stamped the deed Pendleton is using to steal the ranch, and he just mentioned my brother." Cobb frowned. "William? William's been gone for 20 years. Hutch, what does he have to do with this?" I don't know, Hutch said quietly, but Thorne does. And Pendleton's men are going to be hunting him the second the sun comes up. Hutch looked down at the ground. The moon provided just enough light to see a set of clumsy, dragging footprints cutting away from the main trail, heading deep into the jagged limestone badlands. If Briggs finds him first, Thorne won't live to testify in any courtroom. We have to find him tonight. Hutch touched his spurs to Rusty, following the broken trail into the dark. The tracks were messy and deep. A sober man steps light in the badlands. Try not to twist an ankle on the loose limestone. Elias Thorne was dragging his boots, leaving a trail a blind man could follow in the dark. Mateo rode point. He didn't need a lantern. The sliver of moonlight was enough to catch the scuffed rocks and broken sagebrush. He is heading for the old copper claim, Mateo said quietly, pulling his horse to a stop at a fork in the canyon, the one that caved in 5 years ago. Hutch nodded. There was a rusted outline shack up there. It made sense. A scared animal always runs to the deepest hole it can find. They rode in silence for another 40 minutes. The temperature dropped, sinking deep into their wool coats. The smell of dry pine and ancient dust filled the air. When the jagged silhouette of the abandoned mine tipple finally appeared against the night sky, Hutch held up his hand. They dismounted, tying their horses to a dead cedar tree 100 yards downwind. Cobb racked both barrels of his shotgun. The heavy metallic clack sounded uncomfortably loud in the still air. "Easy," Hutch whispered. "He's already spooked. We don't need him shooting at shadows." They walked up the steep, rocky incline toward the shack. The door was hanging off its leather hinges. There was no light inside. No sound either, except the wind whistling through the rotted roof boards. Hutch stepped up to the doorframe. He didn't draw his gun. "Elias," Hutch called out. His voice was steady and low. "It's John Hutchinson. I'm coming in. I'm not here to hurt you." He stepped into the pitch black. The shack smelled like stale whiskey, rat droppings, and fear. "Don't strike a match," a ragged voice croaked from the far corner. Hutch stopped. He could hear the heavy, frantic breathing of the old man. "Why not?" Hutch asked. "Because if I can see you, I might shoot you," Elias stammered. "And if I shoot you, that Mexican outside will skin me alive." Mateo stepped into the doorway, his silhouette blocking the faint moonlight. "I am not Mexican," he said softly. "I am from El Paso, but I will still skin you." Hutch sighed, put the gun down. "Elias, Briggs and his men are probably out looking for you right now. If they find you first, you won't need to worry about being skinned. They'll just bury you." A long silence stretched in the dark. Finally, Hutch heard the heavy thud of a revolver hitting the dirt floor. Hutch struck a match. The sudden flare of sulfur illuminated the cramped shack. Elias was huddled in the corner, clutching his knees to his chest. He looked 20 years older than he had down by the creek. His face was gray, covered in sweat and dirt. Hutch found the stub of a wax candle sitting on a broken crate and lit it. He dragged the crate over and sat down, forcing Elias to look at him. "Tell me about my brother." Hutch said. Elias squeezed his eyes shut. "I swore I'd take it to the grave." "The grave is getting real close. Elias, you told me my grandfather's signature was forged. You told me William did it. Why?" Elias let out a long, rattling breath. "Because he needed the money, John. He owed men in Denver. Bad men. Men who didn't care about homesteads or cattle. They just cared about debts." Hutch felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. William had always been restless. He had hated the dirt, hated the long winters, hated the slow, hard life their father had built. But forgery? stealing the land right out from under them? It was the fall of 74, Elias muttered, staring at the flickering candle flame. Your grandfather had just broken his wrist. William came to me late one night. He had a blank bill of sale. He said he needed my official surveyor's seal and my signature as a witness. And you just gave it to him? Hutch asked, his voice tightening. He gave me $300. Elias cried out, his voice cracking. I was drinking heavy back then, John. I lost my wife the year before. I was drowning. $300 kept me breathing. So William forged the name, you stamped it, and he sold the ranch? Elias shook his head frantically. No, that's the thing. He couldn't sell it. Because the original boundary maps, the ones filed with the territory, didn't match the new railroad surveys. No bank would touch the deed without a clean survey. William took the forged paper and ran. I thought the whole thing was dead and buried. Until Pendleton showed up, Hutch guessed. Elias nodded, wiping his nose with shaking hand. Pendleton Syndicate tracks down old, dead claims. They found William a few years back. Bought the forged deed off him for pennies, probably, but Pendleton is smart. He knows the deed won't hold up in a real federal court without the original survey map proving the boundaries. Hutch leaned forward. So where is the map? Elias looked away. Where is it, Elias? I have it, the old man whispered. I never turned it over to the county. I hid it. I thought maybe one day I could use it to buy my way out of this town. Give it to me, Hutch said, extending his hand. If I have the original map, I can prove Pendleton's deed is tied to a fraudulent boundary. I can take it to the territorial judge and blow this whole syndicate operation wide open. Elias shrank back against the wall. No, you don't understand. Pendleton came to me yesterday. He told me if I don't give him the map by tomorrow morning, Briggs is going to burn this shack down with me inside it. If you give him that map, you're a dead man anyway, Hutch said. He can't leave a witness alive who knows the deed is fake. You hand over that paper, he'll shoot you and throw you down this mine shaft. Your only way out is with me. Elias shook his head stubbornly. I ain't giving it to you. I'm going to run. I'll head south to Mexico. An old man on foot in the desert? Mateo said from the doorway. The buzzards will eat very well. Before Hutch could speak again, a new sound cut through the quiet night. It was sharp, rhythmic, the distinct crunch of horseshoes on loose limestone. Mateo blew the candle out instantly. The shack plunged back into total darkness. How many? Hutch whispered, drawing his Colt revolver from his hip. 6, Mateo replied, his voice barely a breath. Maybe 7. They are moving slow, trying to keep quiet. They tracked us, Cobb muttered, shifting his shotgun against his shoulder. Should have known Briggs wouldn't just let us ride off. Elias let out a panicked whimper in the dark. I told you they were going to kill me. Shut up, Hutch hissed, grabbing the old man by his ragged collar and forcing him flat against the floorboards. Keep your head down and do not move. Hutch moved to the window frame. There was no glass, just a gaping square looking out over the slope. He carefully peeked over the sill. In the pale moonlight, he could see the riders dismounting near the dead cedar tree. They were tying their horses up, pulling rifles from their saddle scabbards. Briggs was massive, standing a head taller than the rest of the men. He was pointing toward the shack, issuing silent orders with his hands. We are in a wooden box, Mateo stated calmly from the other side of the door. Rifle fire will tear these walls to splinters. We need to bottleneck them, Hutch said. Cobb, you take the door. If anyone tries to rush the steps, you take them off their feet. Mateo, You take the window with me. We don't shoot until they cross the 50-yard mark. We need them to think we don't know they're out there." "Understood," Mateo said, cocking the hammer of his revolver. The double click was the only sound in the room. Outside, the syndicate men began their approach. They spread out into a wide skirmish line, using the scattered boulders and dead brush for cover. They were moving like professionals. These weren't just hired thugs. They were men who had done this before. Hutch wiped a bead of sweat from his eye. He thought about his grandfather's oak tree. He thought about the forged signature. He thought about his brother, trading their legacy for a fistful of blood money. The anger finally broke through the cold logic in his chest. They crossed the invisible line. "Now," Hutch said. Hutch stood up and fired twice through the window. The flashes lit up the dark, and the explosive cracks of the heavy-caliber weapon shattered the silence of the canyon. One of the syndicate men cried out and fell backward into the dirt. Mateo fired immediately after, a steady, rhythmic series of shots that forced two more men to die behind a massive limestone boulder. The return fire was instantaneous. A volley of rifle bullets slammed into the shack. The old, dried out wood splintered and exploded inward, with shards flew across the room like shrapnel. Hutch dropped back below the window sill as a slug tore through the wall, directly where his head had been a second before. The noise was deafening. The smell of burning sulfur and pulverized with dust choked the air. "They're moving up the left flank." Cobb yelled over the gunfire. Suddenly, heavy boots hit the front porch. Someone was charging the door. Cobb stepped into the open doorway and pulled the trigger on his shotgun. The blast illuminated the porch in a brilliant flash of orange fire. A man screamed and tumbled backward off the steps, crashing into the brush below. "They got us pinned. Hutch?" Cobb roared, racking the pump and ejecting a smoking red shell onto the floor. "There's too many of them." Hutch looked over at Elias. The old man was curled into a tight ball, his hands over his ears, sobbing uncontrollably as bullets continued to tear through the roof. If they keep this up, they won't even need to burn the place down. They were going to shoot it to pieces, and Hutch, his men, and the only evidence that could save the ranch would be buried under the rubble. Hutch pulled his empty cylinder open and began furiously reloading in the dark. He needed a way out, and he needed it right now. Another volley of rifle fire ripped through the front wall of the shack. The dry pine splintered like dry bones. Hutch pressed his back against the floorboards, spitting with dust from his mouth. A heavy lead slug buried itself into the dirt less than a foot from his head. They couldn't stay here. In 5 minutes, Briggs and his men would realize they didn't need to rush the door. They could just shoot the cabin to pieces until nothing inside was left breathing. "Mateo!" Hutch yelled over the deafening crack of the Winchesters. "How many rounds you got left?" "4. Mateo called back from beneath the shattered window frame. "I'm out of shells," Cobb roared, tossing the empty shotgun aside and pulling a heavy hunting knife from his belt. "Let me rush the door. Hutch, I can take 2 of them before they put me down." "Nobody is rushing the door," Hutch said. He looked around the cramped, pulverized room in the dark. The moonlight was completely choked out by the thick dust hanging in the air. Then he felt it, a cold draft of air pulling at the collar of his coat. It wasn't coming from the bullet holes in the walls. It was coming from beneath him, the floorboards. Hutch rolled over and ran his hands along the dirt and rotting wood. This was an old mining line shack. They built these right over the ventilation shafts of the copper claims. "Help me tear this up," Hutch ordered, grabbing the edge of a loose plank. Cobb crawled over, his heavy hands finding the wood in the dark. Together, they pulled. The rusted iron nails shrieked as the board snapped upward. A blast of cold, damp air rushed up into their faces, smelling of iron ore and deep earth. Hutch ripped another board free, creating a hole just wide enough for a man's shoulders. He grabbed Elias by the collar of his ragged shirt. "Get in." Elias stared down into the pitch-black hole. "It's a drop. I don't know how deep it goes." "You can drop, or you can catch a bullet up here," Hutch said, shoving him toward the opening. "Choose fast." Another bullet tore through the tin stovepipe above their heads, sending soot raining down on them. Elias didn't hesitate. He squeezed through the opening and dropped. A second later, Hutch heard a heavy thud, followed by a groan. "He's alive," Hutch said. "Cobb, go. Billy, you follow him. Mateo, you're with me." Outside, a new sound cut through the gunfire, the sharp crackle of flames. A soft orange glow began to spread across the front porch. "They're burning us out," Mateo stated calmly. "Go," Hutch told him. Mateo slipped silently through the floorboards. Hutch waited a second, feeling the heat of the fire begin to bake the front wall of the shack. He looked at the old, battered walls one last time, then swung his legs into the hole and dropped into the dark. He hit the ground hard. It was a 6-foot drop onto loose rock. The air down here was frigid, thick with the smell of wet stone and decay. Above them, the shack was fully engulfed. The orange firelight spilled through the hole in the ceiling, illuminating the narrow rock tunnel they were standing in. Burning embers began to drift down like hot snow. "Move," Hutch said, pushing past Cobb and grabbing Billy's shoulder. "The roof is going to cave in." They stumbled blindly down the mine shaft. The ground was treacherous, littered with rusted mining tools, rotted support beams, and deep puddles of stagnant water. They kept one hand on the damp rock wall, moving entirely by touch as the tunnel curved away from the firelight above. Behind them, a massive crash shook the earth. The flaming roof of the shack collapsed into the shaft, sending a thick cloud of acrid black smoke billowing down the tunnel. "Keep moving," Hutch coughed, pulling his bandana up over his nose. They walked for what felt like an hour. The smoke eventually thinned, replaced by the heavy, dead air of the deep earth. The silence was absolute. Only the sound of their own ragged breathing and the dripping of water echoed in the blackness. Hutch stopped. He pulled his silver pocket watch and struck a lucifer match against the brass casing. The small yellow flame flared to life. They were standing in a dead end. The tunnel simply stopped at a solid wall of collapsed granite. A cave-in from years ago had completely sealed the shaft. "There's no way out," Billy whispered, his voice trembling. "We're buried alive." Hutch held the match higher. The flame illuminated Elias Thorne, huddled against the rock wall. "Elias," Hutch said, stepping closer, "you brought us here, not to the shack, to this mine." Elias looked up, his pale eyes catching the matchlight. "You didn't hide the map in the shack," Hutch realized. "You knew Pendleton's men would tear it apart. You hid it down here." Elias slowly nodded. He pushed himself off the wet rock floor and walked over to the collapsed granite wall. He reached his hand deep into a narrow crevice between two massive boulders. His arm disappeared up to the elbow. He twisted his wrist, grunting with effort, and pulled back. In his hand was a rusted tin tube, capped with heavy wax on both ends. Elias held it out. His hands were shaking violently. "Here. It's the original survey of the Hutchinson homestead, dated October 1874. Signed by me and stamped with a territorial seal." Hutch took the cold tin tube. The match burned down to his fingers. He blew it out, plunging them back into darkness. "Mateo, give me your candle," Hutch said. A moment later, The stub of wax flared to life in Mateo's hand. Hutch drew his hunting knife and cracked the hardened wax seal on the end of the tube. He pulled out a tight roll of heavy, yellowed paper. It smelled of old oil and dry rot. He carefully unrolled it against the flat side of a rock. It was a beautiful piece of draftsmanship. The property lines of his grandfather's ranch were drawn in precise black ink, tracing the bends of Sweetwater Creek and the limestone ridges. In the bottom right corner was the official surveyor's seal. "This proves the boundaries on Pendleton's deed are fraudulent," Hutch said quietly. "It proves the document is a fake." But Elias wasn't looking at the map. He was looking at a smaller, folded piece of paper that had fallen out of the tube and landed in the dirt. Hutch saw it. He picked it up. "What is this?" Hutch asked. Elias wiped a layer of dirt from his face. "I told you your brother needed money. I told you he owed bad men in Denver. That is the promissory note. The men he owed forced him to write it out before they left town. They wanted proof of his debt. I found it in his saddlebag the night he ran, after he paid me off." Hutch unfolded the small, brittle paper. The handwriting hit him like a physical blow to the chest. It was a confession of debt, promising to pay $3,000 to a Denver gambling syndicate. But it wasn't what the letter said that made Hutch stop breathing. It was how it was written. The black ink, the perfectly steady hand, the distinct, looping S at the end of the signature. William Hutchinson. It was the exact same handwriting that was on the forged deed. The exact same looping S that supposedly belonged to their grandfather. Hutch stared at his brother's signature. The betrayal was no longer a story from an old drunk. It was right here, resting in the palm of his hand. His own blood had sold their legacy for the price of a gambling debt. William had sat at a table, practiced their grandfather's signature until it was perfect, and traded away the dirt their family had bled for. Pendleton didn't forge the deed. Hutch whispered. "No," Elias said quietly. "Your brother did. Pendleton just bought the paper." "And you kept this note?" Hutch asked, looking up at the old surveyor. "I kept it as insurance," Elias said, "in case William ever came back and tried to blame the forgery entirely on me. It proves he was the one holding the pen." Hutch folded the note carefully and placed it in his breast pocket, right over his heart. It felt heavier than a block of lead. To save his ranch, he wouldn't just have to beat Arthur Pendleton in a courtroom. He would have to stand in front of the entire town of Oak Haven, pull this paper from his pocket, and publicly destroy his own family's name. He would have to prove to the world that a Hutchinson was a thief. "We need to get out of here," Cobb said, breaking the heavy silence. "The air is getting thin." Hutch looked up, above the collapsed granite wall. There was a narrow fissure angling sharply upward. Faint, gray light was filtering through the cracks. "Draft shaft," Mateo noted, looking at the light. "We can climb it." Hutch rolled the map back up and slid it into the tin tube. He capped the end and shoved it into his belt. He didn't say another word. He started climbing the jagged rock wall, pulling himself up toward the gray light. It took 20 minutes of agonizing effort to squeeze through the narrow fissure. The rock tore at their clothes and skinned their knuckles. When Hutch finally hauled himself over the edge, he was met with the freezing air of the high desert dawn. The sun was just beginning to crack the eastern horizon, bleeding pale pink and gold across the bruised sky. They were standing on the far side of the limestone ridge, a mile away from the burned-out line shack. The vast expanse of the valley stretched out below them. "Where are the horses?" Billy asked, pulling himself out of the hole. Hutch looked down toward the line shack. A thick column of black smoke was rising into the morning sky. The dead cedar tree where they had tied Rusty and the other horses was empty. "Briggs found them," Hutch said flatly. They took our mounts. They think we burned up in that shack. So they took the horses and rode back to town. Cobb let out a long string of colorful curses. It's a 12-mile walk back to Oakhaven. We ain't gonna make it. Hutch pulled out his grandfather's silver pocket watch. He flipped open the cracked glass face. It was 6 a.m. The territorial judge hears injunctions at 9. Hutch said, his jaw locked tight. If Pendleton finalizes that deed before we get to the courthouse, he takes legal possession. Once the gavel falls, the federal marshals will throw us off the land by noon. Mateo looked out across the brush. 12 miles in 3 hours. On foot. We don't walk, Hutch said, his eyes scanning the horizon. He pointed to a small cluster of cottonwood trees, about 2 miles to the south. Plumes of white dust were kicking up around a crude wooden corral. Miller's farm. Pendleton bought it last month, Cobb said, squinting against the rising sun. And Pendleton's men use it to hold their remuda. Hutch said, we're going to borrow some syndicate horses. Hutch started down the steep, rocky slope, his boots sliding in the loose shale. He could feel the tin tube pressing against his ribs. The trial wasn't just about dirt anymore. It was about truth, and the truth was going to burn down Arthur Pendleton's entire world. The Miller farm was heavily guarded, but syndicate men didn't expect a raid from dead men. Mateo handled the guard at the corral with a heavy piece of oak to the back of the head. It wasn't loud and it wasn't lethal, but the man wouldn't be waking up until noon. They saddled 4 fresh geldings bearing the Northern Pacific brand. Elias rode double behind Cobb. They didn't bother opening the gate. Hutch spurred his horse and jumped the low timber fence, the others right behind him. They hit the main trail hard. The rising sun baked the dust into a blinding white haze. Hutch kept his grandfather's watch in his hand, checking it every few miles. 7:30, 8:15, 8:40. By the time Oakhaven came into view, the streets were already thick with morning traffic. Wagons rattled over the dry ruts. Merchants swept their boardwalks. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that a mile away, a man's legacy was about to be erased by a stroke of a pen. The Oakhaven courthouse was a heavy stone building at the end of Main Street. It had tall, narrow windows that made it look more like a fortress than a hall of justice. Hutch pulled his horse, so hard the gelding reared back, its hooves striking the wooden boardwalk in front of the stone steps. Mateo, Cobb, and Billy pulled up in a cloud of dust. Hutch didn't tie the reins. He just dropped them and took the stairs 3 at a time. Inside, the courtroom was stifling. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed wool, cheap tobacco, and tension. Half the town had shown up to watch the hanging, even if the rope was made of paper. Martha was sitting in the second row, twisting a lace handkerchief so hard her knuckles were white. At the front of the room, Judge Carter sat behind a massive oak bench. He was a stern, tired man with a drooping gray mustache. Arthur Pendleton stood at the plaintiff's table. He looked pristine. His suit was perfectly brushed, his silk cravat tied tight. He was holding the forged deed in his hand, smiling patiently as his hired lawyer finished reading the final eviction clause. "Therefore, Your Honor," the lawyer droned, pushing his spectacles up his nose. "The Northern Pacific Syndicate formally requests immediate transference of title and eviction of all current occupants of the Hutchinson property." Judge Carter picked up his wooden gavel. "Is there any representative for the defense?" Silence hung in the hot room. Pendleton's smile widened slightly. Carter sighed and raised the gavel. Then, by the authority of the territory, the heavy double doors of the courtroom slammed open. The wood cracked against the plaster walls like a gunshot. Every head in the room, snapped around. Hutch walked down the center aisle. His clothes were torn and covered in soot. His face was streaked with dirt and dried sweat. He smelled like sulfur and burning pine. Mateo and Cobb walked right behind him, keeping a tight grip on a trembling Elias Thorne. "The defense is here," Hutch said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a rusted blade. Pendleton's smile vanished. He stared at Hutch, then his eyes flicked to Elias. The color completely drained from the syndicate man's face. He looked toward the back of the room, searching for Briggs, but his massive enforcer was nowhere to be seen. "Your Honor," Pendleton's lawyer stammered, recovering his wits. "This is highly irregular. Mr. Hutchinson has missed his allotted time to—" "Sit down," Judge Carter snapped, pointing his gavel at the lawyer. "John, you look like you just crawled out of a prairie fire. What exactly are you doing in my courtroom?" Hutch stopped at the wooden railing, separating the gallery from the court. "I am here to prove that Arthur Pendleton is attempting to steal my family's land using fraudulent documents." Pendleton stepped forward, his polished voice returning. "Your Honor, we have already verified the deed. 3 territorial clerks have authenticated the signature of Silas Hutchinson. The document is ironclad. This man is simply desperate." Hutch ignored Pendleton entirely. He reached into his belt and pulled out the rusted tin tube. He cracked the wax seal on the bottom and slid the yellow parchment out, unrolling it flat on the defense table. "That deed might be stamped," Hutch said, looking up at the judge, "but it's tied to an illegal boundary. This is the original survey map of the Hutchinson homestead, drawn in 1874. Judge Carter leaned over his bench, his eyes narrowing. "Where did you get that?" "The county records office claimed the original map was destroyed in a flood 10 years ago. "It wasn't destroyed," Hutch said. "It was hidden by the man who drew it." Hutch gestured behind him. Cobb shoved Elias forward. The old surveyor stumbled against the wooden railing, looking completely terrified. "Elias Thorne," Hutch announced, "former county surveyor. He can testify that the borders drawn on Pendleton's deed encompass land that was never legally surveyed for sale. The syndicate drew their own lines to include the river and the valley pass." The courtroom erupted into a low murmur. Martha stood up in the gallery, her eyes wide with shock. Pendleton slammed his hand on his table. "This is absurd. You bring a drunkard into this court to peddle fairy tales? The deed has Silas Hutchinson's signature. That is the only thing that matters in the eyes of the law. If Silas signed it, he sold it. Period." The murmur in the room died down. Pendleton was right. A bad map didn't invalidate a legal sale. It just meant the borders had to be redrawn. If the signature was real, Hutch still lost the land. Hutch looked down at the table. He felt the weight of the promissory note burning in his breast pocket. He had spent his entire life defending his family's name. He had fought cattle rustlers, drought, and blizzards to keep their legacy alive. To save the ranch, he had to kill the legacy. "My grandfather didn't sign that paper," Hutch said softly. Pendleton sneered. "The territory says otherwise. You cannot prove a forgery after 50 years, Mr. Hutchinson. You have no evidence." Hutch reached into his coat. He pulled out the brittle, folded piece of paper. His hand was shaking. He had held a gun steady on a dozen men in his life, but holding this piece of paper made his blood run cold. "I have this," Hutch said. He walked up to the judge's bench and laid the paper down. Judge Carter picked it up. "What is this, John?" "It's a promissory note," Hutch said, his voice tightening. "Dated October 14, 1874. The exact same day that deed was allegedly signed. It's a confession of debt to a Denver gambling syndicate. for $3,000. Judge Carter read the note. He frowned, looking closely at the ink. "Look at the signature. Carter," Hutch said. The judge adjusted his spectacles. He looked at the bottom of the note. He looked at the forged deed lying on Pendleton's table. "Yes," the judge whispered. Hutch nodded, turning around to face the crowded courtroom. "My grandfather didn't sell the land. My older brother, William, racked up a gambling debt he couldn't pay. So he stole a blank bill of sale. He paid Elias Thorne $300 to stamp it. And then William sat at a table and perfectly forged our grandfather's signature." A collective gasp ripped through the gallery. Martha pressed her hands to her mouth. Hutch looked right at Pendleton. His eyes were hard and completely empty. "William couldn't sell it to a bank because he didn't have the map," Hutch continued, his voice echoing in the silent room. "So he sold the forged paper to cheap debt collectors and ran. It bounced around a territory for decades until your syndicate bought it for pennies. You knew it was a fake, but you also knew William's forgery was good enough to fool a clerk." Pendleton was staring at the promissory note on the judge's bench. His jaw worked silently. The polished, untouchable facade was cracking. "Objection!" Pendleton's lawyer shouted, his voice cracking. "This is hearsay. A random piece of paper does not prove." "It proves everything," Judge Carter interrupted, slamming his gavel down so hard the handle nearly cracked. He held the promissory note up to the light. The ink pressure, the looping structure of the letters. It is an identical match to the deed, and this note is signed by William Hutchinson. Carter looked down at Elias Thorne. "Mr. Thorne, you are under oath in my courtroom. Did William Hutchinson forge that deed in your presence?" Elias looked at Pendleton. Then he looked at Hutch. The old man took a deep, rattling breath and finally stood up straight. "Yes, Your Honor. He forged it, and I stamped it. May God forgive me." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Men were shouting. The jury box was a flurry of motion. Arthur Pendleton didn't shout. He didn't object. He just slowly sank into his wooden chair, staring at the floorboards. His ocean of ink had just dried up. "Order!" Judge Carter roared, slamming his gavel repeatedly until the room settled into a tense, vibrating silence. The judge picked up Pendleton's forged deed. He tore it in half. "This court finds a claim of the Northern Pacific Syndicate to be entirely fraudulent," Carter declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "The injunction against the Hutchinson estate is lifted immediately. All assets are unfrozen." Carter pointed his gavel directly at Pendleton. "And I am issuing a territorial warrant for your arrest, Mr. Pendleton, on the charges of fraud, extortion, and attempted murder. Marshal, take him into custody." 2 federal marshals stepped out from the back of the room and grabbed Pendleton by the arms, hauling him out of his chair. He didn't fight them. He didn't even look at Hutch as they dragged him down the aisle. Hutch stood alone at the railing. The gavel had fallen. The land was his. But as the townspeople rushed forward to clap him on the back, Hutch felt entirely hollow. He looked at the torn pieces of the deed on the floor. He had won the dirt, but he had just told the whole world that his brother was a thief. Some dirt, he realized, cost more than blood. It cost your soul. The heavy oak doors of the courthouse closed behind Hutch with a solid, echoing thud. The midday sun hit him instantly, blinding and hot. Main Street was a hornet's nest of activity. Word had already spilled out of the gallery and onto the boardwalk. The Northern Pacific Syndicate had been broken. Arthur Pendleton was sitting in a holding cell waiting for a federal transport, his silk suits traded for iron cuffs. Hutch walked down the stone steps. Every muscle in his body ached. He smelled of old dirt, sweat, and gunpowder. "John, wait just a minute," John. Silas Higgins was scurrying down the boardwalk, dabbing his sweating forehead with a white handkerchief. The bank manager looked terrified. John, Higgins panted, catching up to him. I just got word from the clerk. The injunction is formally lifted. Your accounts are fully restored. You can come by the bank right now and pull your payroll. I can even extend your credit line if you need to repair any damages to the ranch. Hutch didn't stop walking. He didn't even look at the man. I'll be by tomorrow morning. Silas, Hutch said, his voice flat and tired. Have the money ready. Higgins swallowed hard, nodding frantically. Yes, of course. First thing tomorrow. Hutch stepped off the boardwalk and into the dusty street. Mateo, Cobb, and Billy were waiting by the borrowed horses. Elias Thorne was sitting on a wooden bench outside the telegraph office. The old surveyor looked entirely exhausted, staring down at his trembling hands. Hutch walked over to him. Elias looked up, flinching slightly as if expecting a blow. I'm sorry, John. I should have told you years ago. I was just so scared of him. Hutch reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a leather money clip and peeled off 3 $20 bills. He held them out. Buy a train ticket. Hutch said softly, get out of Oak Haven. Go somewhere warm and dry, and stop looking over your shoulder. Pendleton is finished, and nobody is coming after you. Elias stared at the money. Tears welled up in his pale, bloodshot eyes. He reached out with a shaking hand and took the bills. Thank you, John. Hutch turned away. He didn't want the old man's gratitude. He just wanted to go home. They mounted the stolen syndicate horses and rode out of town. The ride back to the valley was long and entirely silent. It wasn't the tense, suffocating silence of the night before. It was a heavy, hollow quiet that settles over a battlefield long after the cannon stopped firing. As they crested the final limestone ridge, Hutch pulled his horse up. Down in the valley, the air was clear. There was no smoke rising from the north pasture, no sound of axes biting into timber. Instead, there was a low, steady rush of moving water. Down at the choke point of Sweetwater Creek, a dozen men on horseback were dragging the heavy pine logs out of the muddy channel with thick hemp ropes. Hutch recognized the horses. They belonged to Miller and the other local farmers. The minute they heard Pendleton was arrested, they had ridden out to break the syndicate's dam. The water was flowing again, rushing clear and cold across the dry earth. Let's go home, Hutch said. When they finally rode to the cedar gate of the ranch, Rusty was standing in the corral. The roan gelding let out an angry, hungry whinny. The syndicate men who had stolen the horses last night had abandoned them the second they realized the law was turning against them. Cobb slid out of his saddle, groaning loudly as his knees popped. He leaned heavily against a wooden fence post. I am entirely too old to be crawling through copper mines, Cobb muttered, wiping a layer of gray dust from his face. My back feels like it got kicked by a stubborn mule. Mateo began uncinching his saddle. He looked over at Hutch. We get paid today? Hutch managed a small, exhausted smile. Bank opens at 8 tomorrow morning. You get your full wages, and a bonus for the bullets you spent. Billy was just standing near the watering trough, staring up at the open blue sky. He was grinning like a fool who had just cheated the hangman. We beat them, he whispered almost to himself. We actually beat them. Hutch left the men to tend the horses. He walked alone past the empty bunkhouse and up the low, grassy hill on the north ridge. He stopped under the massive branches of the old oak tree. At the base of the trunk was a simple, weathered headstone, his mother's grave. The wind blew through the dry leaves, creating a soft, whispering sound. Hutch reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the brittle, folded promissory note. The piece of paper that proved his own flesh and blood was a thief. He stared at his brother's perfectly steady handwriting. He had spent his whole life defending the Hutchinson name. He had fought rustlers, droughts, and bankers to keep their legacy intact. He always believed that blood was the strongest thing in the world. But blood had sold him out for $3,000 and a gambling debt. Hutch pulled a lucifer match from his vest. He struck it against the heel of his boot. He touched the yellow flame to the corner of the promissory note. The old paper caught instantly. He held it until the fire licked at his fingertips, then dropped the burning paper onto the dry dirt. He watched the confession curl and blacken, turning his brother's betrayal into gray ash. The wind caught the embers, scattering them out over the prairie grass until nothing was left. The court didn't need the evidence anymore. The law was satisfied, and the ghost of William Hutchinson was finally put to rest. Later that evening, the sun dipped below the jagged western mountains, casting a rich, golden light over the valley. The air turned crisp and cool. Hutch was sitting in a wooden rocking chair on the front porch, a cup of hot black coffee resting on his knee. The bruises on his ribs ached with every breath, but he didn't care. A horse and buggy rattled into the yard. Martha climbed down. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked up the wooden steps, carrying a heavy canvas sack, and set it down on the porch boards. Flour, coffee, and a bottle of good rye whiskey, Martha said, taking a seat in the empty chair next to him. "I figure your boys earned a stiff drink tonight." Hutch nodded, looking out over the yard. "I appreciate it, Martha. Put it on my tab. The bank unfroze my accounts." "I know," she said smoothly. "I was in the courtroom, remember?" They sat in comfortable silence for a long moment, listening to the faint, distant sound of Sweetwater Creek cutting through the valley. From the bunkhouse, Cobb let out a booming laugh, followed by the soft, rhythmic strumming of Mateo's old guitar. "You did a hard thing today, John," Martha said quietly, turning to look at his bruised face. "Tearing down your own family's name in front of the whole county. That couldn't have been easy." Hutch took a slow sip of his coffee. It tasted perfect. "My grandfather built this place with his bare hands," Hutch said, his voice low and steady. "He fought for it, bled for it. William thought he could just sign a piece of paper and make all that sweat disappear. I spent my whole life trying to protect my family's legacy." Hutch lowered his mug. He looked over at the bunkhouse, watching the warm lantern light spill out of the windows. He listened to the laughter of the men who had stood beside him in the dark, ready to die for a piece of dirt that didn't even belong to them. "Turns out the legacy wasn't the blood," Hutch said. Martha smiled softly. "Where is it then?" "The legacy is the dirt," Hutch replied, his eyes tracing the silhouette of the ridge against the twilight sky. "And the people willing to stand on it with you." Martha reached out and placed her hand over his. Her grip was strong and warm. "Well," she said, leaning back in her chair, "you got very good dirt, Hutch, and you've got very good people." Hutch didn't say anything else. He just squeezed her hand, listening to the guitar and the wind in the grass. The land was safe. The water was running. And for the first time in a very long time, John Hutchinson felt entirely at peace.